A few minutes before the president came by Dealey Plaza, a young man standing on the sidewalk suffered what apparently was an epileptic fit. And I think this was an assassination plot action that was intended in Dealey Plaza at least to create a diversion so that people involved with the assassination mechanics could position themselves without being conspicuous. But anyway, this is the radio traffic that reflects that event. I've edited out things that aren't related here. And what I want to point out here is that the ambulance 606 says we're en route to Parkland, and signal 16 means that they want a police officer to meet them at the hospital to investigate the injured person. It's not clear why that was requested, but the dispatcher sent number 23 patrolman B.E. Barnes to investigate. And the only other mention in the evidence of this Barnes comes from this information, which comes from the Dallas Police. It says B.E. Barnes assigned to District 23, Car 15, dispatched to Parkland Memorial Hospital following assassination. That is not correct. He was dispatched to Parkland Hospital prior to the assassination. And there's nothing else. The investigation, such as it was, into this incident, did not apparently question Patrolman Barnes, or if they did, they didn't make a report, or if they made a report, they're not letting us see it. So we never hear from Barnes again. And the first hint we get of an investigative interest in this, comes from Sergeant Harkness, who on the radio, 18 minutes after the assassination, said, "We had an epileptic seizure just before this, and he went to Parkland Hospital. Send someone down there to get all the information he can from this person." And there is no indication anywhere that anybody followed up on this suggestion from Harkness. And very shortly afterwards, Sergeant Harkness was sent to go search railroad cars. Now, apparently the first time the FBI started getting curious about this was on December 20th, 1963, when they interviewed Mr. J.R. Freeman, Dallas Morning News. He works at the Dallas Morning News. Advised that an agent of the Dallas office has during the past few days interviewed several female employees of the society section of the Dallas Morning News. And they must be referring to an FBI agent, but there's no evidence of it that I can find elsewhere. He said the agent made inquiry regarding an incident that involved an ambulance picking up a young person off the street about 5 minutes before the presidential motorcade arrived at the Houston Elm Street intersection on 11/22/63. He stated that he has learned that Buster Haas, who works in the newsroom during the evening and night hours, who could be contacted at home during the day, can furnish considerable information regarding the above referred to incidents, as Haas had a position of vantage and viewed this entire incident as well as the motorcade. And on this document it says that they're planning to interview Haas, but I have found no document of such an interview. In fact, the only other Buster Haas thing I could find that has anything to do with the assassination was this post-mortem article in the Dallas Morning News. And where I have incident here is where in his narrative the incident would be if he had said anything about it, but he didn't. So Buster Haas, who had all this great information, apparently was never asked about it. And then on May 12th, 1964, the FBI got a call from Dan Dawson, who had worked for O'Neill Funeral Home on the day of the assassination. That had been his job. And he tips them off about this incident. He said, stated dispatched an ambulance to the location and picked up victim of epileptic fit. Stated the ambulance he had dispatched to the scene then drove victim to Parkland Hospital. While ambulance driver was in process of registering victim at hospital, victim disappeared. So the good citizens of Dallas are really trying to help out the FBI on this. And on May 28th, 1964, the FBI finally talks to Aubrey Reich, who was the ambulance driver. Starting with the second paragraph, Reich advised on November 22, 1963, while he was employed by O'Neill Incorporated funeral directors, that at 12:19 p.m. on that date, he and ambulance attendant Dennis McGuire were dispatched in ambulance number 606 to pick up an injured person at 100 North Houston Street, Dallas, Texas. Reich said when they got to the scene, they picked up a man who was conscious and only slightly injured with a facial laceration. He said this man did not appear in bad shape, but, according to his recollection, had suffered an epileptic seizure. Reich advised he took this man to Parkland Hospital, and within moments after arriving, President Kennedy was brought to Parkland Hospital. Reich stated there was much confusion at the hospital, and during this confusion, the patient he had just brought to the hospital walked off. Reich stated he does not recall this man's name, but it should be in the records at O'Neill Incorporated Funeral Directors. Reich stated he was advised by a Secret Service agent at Parkland Hospital that his ambulance was not to be moved because they might need it to move the president to another location. And in this photograph, this is while the casket is arriving from O'Neill's. You can see that ambulance 606 is still there. I think this is said to be around 1:45. So they stayed there just as the Secret Service requested. Reich stated he cleared the hospital at 3 p.m. and returned to O'Neill Incorporated funeral directors. Well, he couldn't have... This is not correct. He did not clear the hospital at 3 p.m. What happened was the Secret Service commandeered the hearse, and the crew that came with the hearse got into ambulance 606, and they went to Love Field. And here it says, this is ambulance 606 talking on the radio. We were instructed here at Parkland to clear through you to get us cleared through Love Field area. We have a coach for the casket. So the O'Neill crew is going, both O'Neill crews are going in ambulance 606 while the Secret Service drives the hearse. And here after 2:13 p.m. they're still looking for the ambulance. They're at Love Field and they're looking to find their ambulance. So it seems to me funny that Aubrey Reich wouldn't remember this, that he would think that they had just left the hospital at 3 o'clock, and because this is the day the president was murdered, and they had to follow. I don't think they were following within sight of the hearse, but they had to follow them to Love Field because they had to retrieve their hearse. And I would think that would be a very memorable adventure that he would not forget. Of course, we have an FBI document here, and with FBI documents you can never tell what the witness said and what the FBI said because they don't generally quote the witness. But if that's really, it makes me wonder whether or not they really interviewed Reich, or whether they just made it up. And also on May 28th, the FBI talked to somebody at O'Neill Funeral Home, Jimmy Lee McIntyre. McIntyre said the patient's name was Jerry B. Belknap. This is the guy who had the seizure. McIntyre said when this ambulance arrived at Parkland Hospital, there was much confusion since President Kennedy had at about the same time also arrived at Parkland Hospital. He advised that in the resulting confusion, Belknap, who did not seem to be seriously injured, walked away without ever signing in at the hospital. McIntyre stated that on December 2nd, 1963, Belknap paid his ambulance bill of $12.50. So on May 28, 1964, the FBI has finally identified Jerry Belknap as the victim, or as the patient. And here we've got him in Find a Grave. He didn't have a very long life, but who knows whether that has anything to do with anything. And then on June 8th, 1964, the FBI talks to Jerry, and He advised that on November 22, 1963, he traveled from Irving to Dallas, Texas by bus, leaving Irving, Texas at about 11:45 a.m. After arriving in Dallas, Belknap stated he proceeded to 100 North Houston Street, from which point he intended to watch the presidential motorcade. He said he was standing on the west side of the street. At approximately 12:10 p.m., Belknap advised he felt a fainting spell coming on and attempted to move back away from the crowd. While in the process of moving from his position, Belknap said he fainted and fell onto the sidewalk. Within a few minutes of fainting, Belknap stated an ambulance from O'Neill Incorporated Funeral Directors, 3206 Oak Lawn Avenue, Dallas, Texas, arrived and took him in the ambulance to Parkland Memorial Hospital. Belknap said he does not believe he lost consciousness. Belknap stated that shortly after the ambulance attendants carried him on the stretcher into Parkland Memorial Hospital, President Kennedy was brought into the hospital. He advised there was much confusion at the hospital and little attention was being paid to him. He said he got a glass of water from a nurse and took his medication, which he is required to take 3 times daily, but had neglected to do so on this particular day. After taking this medication, Belknap stated he felt much better, informed the nurse of this, and walked out of the hospital without ever registering as a patient. Belknap advised this was around 2 p.m., and he stated that he then returned to the Dallas Morning News, Dallas, Texas, where he was employed, working part-time in the mailroom. And if you recall, the Dallas Morning News is where the FBI had started their investigation of this. They were talking to J.R. Freeman, who works at the Dallas Morning News, who was talking about Buster Haas, who works at the Dallas Morning News. And lo and behold, the guy who had the epileptic attack, or whatever it was, also worked at the Dallas Morning News. And the Federal Bureau of Investigation didn't catch on to that until June of 1964, more than 6 months later. Regarding the nature of his illness, Belknap explained that several years ago he was struck by a car and suffered a head injury. He stated since that time he has had fainting spells and is required to take medication 3 times daily to prevent this. He stated he does not believe his fainting spells are any type of epilepsy. Belknap stated that while he was at 100 North Houston Street awaiting the presidential motorcade, he did not observe anything in the Texas School Book Depository building, which was just north of where he was standing, that would arouse suspicion. He said that he left the location before the presidential motorcade arrived, and he don't know nothing and don't know nobody. So, as I said before, I do think that this incident was a planned part of the assassination, a diversion so that assassination players could take their places. And therefore, I am very suspicious of Jerry Boyd Belknap. I don't know if he really was the person who had the fit. I assume he was, and that he was hired to do this. Either that or someone else had the fit, and then he was hired to say that he had. But I don't know. We've got the documentation apparently from O'Neill's, unless O'Neill's is involved. Anyway, that's all I know about Jerry. What I think is more interesting about this than Jerry himself is the investigation into this incident. It was off to a hot start with Sergeant Harkness. Just a few minutes after the assassination, he was saying this should be investigated. And the FBI apparently was investigating this in December at the right place, the Dallas Morning News, but they didn't find that Jerry Belknap worked there, apparently. And it wasn't until May that they started reinvestigating. Several months later, somebody calls them and tips them off. And then, even then, it's 2 weeks before they follow up on the tip and talk to O'Neill ambulance personnel. And even after that, it's more than a week before they bother talking to Jerry Belknap. So I do think this was an assassination ploy, and that the FBI knew that it was, and that's why they dragged their feet investigating it. And I'm sure they didn't do as probing a job as they could have done if they wanted to get some real answers. And that's your Federal Bureau of Investigation